My name is Sarah Mansour. I'm a research assistant at the Jean Monnet Network on Transatlantic Trade Politics. This is part of a series of interviews for the network called the Transatlantic Trade Videos. We're here today with Professor Achim Hurrelmann, who is a professor of political science and co-director of the Center of European Studies at Carleton University. Welcome, Professor Hurrelmann, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
My pleasure.
So, my first question is, how does Brexit impact Canada's trade agreements with Europe in general?
Well, the most important effect is that the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, that has been in force between Canada and the EU since 2017, will no longer apply to the United Kingdom after the end of this year, 2020. And that means that Canada's most important trading partner in Europe, the United Kingdom, is no longer covered by the CETA agreement. The CETA agreement will have to be replaced between Canada and the UK with a new bilateral trade agreement. That's the most important effect of Brexit, but there are further effects on Canada's trade with Europe as well. For instance, there are a lot of Canadian companies that have used the UK as their entry point into the EU single market. For instance, by investing in the UK, set up production there, and they depend on the future relationship, the future economic relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union, which is being negotiated, but Canada has very little leverage to influence that. What Canada can do is try to work out this new trade agreement with the UK.
What can we expect from a Canada-UK trade agreement post-Brexit? What are the challenges that we're likely to see with such an agreement, and what reactions can we expect from the public?
So first of all, both sides, Canada and the UK, do have an interest in negotiating such a deal. So I'm quite optimistic that it will come about. Both sides like the CETA agreement at the moment, and that means that there's an obvious template to build on in negotiating such a new agreement. At the same time, the devil is always in the detail. For instance, there can be problems in the dairy sector, which is always a problematic sector for Canadian trade agreements. Canada has granted certain dairy quotas to the European Union in the CETA agreement. These will remain in place, and the UK will be requesting additional dairy quotas. So that might be an issue that will engage Canadian stakeholders. I would not expect this to be an issue where the broader population becomes very engaged. It's more an issue of interest group lobbying. The broader population will likely not debate such an agreement very much unless two conditions are met. In the UK, there could be a broader debate if an agreement between Canada and the UK gets entangled into negotiations between the UK and the US about a new trade agreement, because the US, that's always much more critical. They have a different regulatory philosophy, and there's lots of issues of identity at stake as well. So if Canada is seen as kind of a Trojan horse for a UK-US agreement, then it could become more controversial in the UK. On the Canadian side, I would see an agreement with the UK to be controversial only if it gets tied into broader debates about Canada's role in the world. Do we want to align with the Anglosphere, with the US, with the UK, or do we see ourselves more as a Europeanist player or internationalist player?
Do you expect one country to benefit more than the other from a Canada-UK trade agreement?
At this point, I think it's not so much really for both parties about benefiting, but more about minimizing the losses of losing the trade agreement. In that sense, I think that both parties have relatively comparable interests in just finding some solution to keep the benefits of the CETA agreement in place. So no, I don't think one side will lose more than the other. And both have an interest in concluding a new agreement. At the same time, it's also interesting that for neither of the two partners, this agreement seems to be at the very top of their trade policy priorities at the moment. For the United Kingdom, they obviously have to reconfigure their entire trade policy in the world. They are negotiating with multiple partners at the same time, and Canada is not the most important of them. The United States, for instance, obviously is much more important. For Canada, it's important to realize that Canada mainly exports to the UK precious stones and metals, especially gold, and that's one export that's relatively little impacted by tariffs. So therefore, Canada at the moment is taking more of a wait-and-see attitude and says, let the UK settle its relationship with the EU first, and then we will come in and negotiate this new agreement. So while both sides want an agreement in place, neither is pursuing it very aggressively at this point.
And how have Canadian political parties, as well as the public, perceived Brexit? In general, have we been more for or against the UK's decision to leave the European Union?
That is very interesting because in this respect we see a very clear partisan divide in Canadian politics. We did some public opinion research for a project that I'm leading. It's called the Reconfiguration of Canada-Europe Relations After Brexit, which involves various Canadian universities. And we did a public opinion survey in 2019 on perceptions of Brexit and perceptions of the future of Canada's relationship with Europe. And one of the most interesting things that we found is that there's a very big divide between people who support the Liberals or the NDP on the one hand and people who support Conservatives on the other hand. The Conservatives have been very much in favor of Brexit and also see Canada after Brexit aligning primarily with the UK and what is sometimes called the Anglosphere or the CanZac, Canada, New Zealand, Australia and the UK as a new vision for a trade agreement. While on the other hand, the Liberal Party has really embraced Canada's strategic partnership with the European Union. Representatives of the Liberal Party have been very critical of Brexit and have presented it as an inward-looking nationalist project that is similar to, for instance, the populist project of Donald Trump in the United States. And supporters of the Liberal Party, as well as supporters of the NDP in our survey, were also very much more likely to be against Brexit and to privilege Canada's relationship with the EU and with the Eurosphere, if you will, as a vision for Canada's international alignment going forward. This is interesting because if you look at policy, sheer policy, trade policy, which kind of agreements should Canada make, there's actually not very much difference between Conservative and Liberal or NDP positions. Both say, of course we want to have a new trade agreement with the United Kingdom, of course we want to continue the CETA agreement with the remaining member states of the European Union. So it's not so much an issue of policy as it is an issue of Canada's broader international identity. But that is of course quite relevant and could become more important in the medium to long term.
Canada has strong bilateral relations with the European Union and has particularly good relations with the UK. How does Brexit impact these relations now, and how will it impact them in the future?
Well, I think obviously, as you said, Canada has a very strong relationship with the UK, which is, if you will, a post-colonial relationship, and that relationship will remain. There's no question about that. But Brexit does raise, as I just tried to explain, this question for where does Canada position itself in the world? Obviously, Canada being a bilingual country has always had relationships with both France and the United Kingdom as being quite foundational to the Canadian identity. And Canada has also felt internationalism being quite foundational to the Canadian identity. But all of this could quite well be combined with each other while the United Kingdom was in the European Union. Because the European Union can be presented as an internationalist, multilateralist project, and it also included both the UK and France. So it was quite easy for Canada to sort of reconcile these internal tensions while the United Kingdom was in the EU. And the biggest challenge, as far as I can see, for Canada's role in the world posed by Brexit is that Canada will need to redefine this. And especially if the Brexit negotiation in Europe gets more contentious, then it might become necessary for Canada to set its priorities and say we see ourselves either as being aligned with the UK and the Anglosphere, or we see ourselves aligned with France and the EU and the broader multilateralist project that the EU represents. And that would be a contentious internal debate within Canada.
And finally, what can policymakers do to prevent or to address the politicization and the contentious aspect of transatlantic trade agreements, particularly in the case of a Canada-UK deal?
Well, that is a difficult question because I would say there's different types of politicization. So on the one hand, we see for instance, in Canada, political parties trying to sort of appeal to their own supporters by painting Brexit in a particular light, a positive light in the case of the Conservatives, a more negative light in the case of the Liberals. With this type of party politicization, I would advise that policymakers should largely ignore that, not get too upset about it, and just try to carry on and say it's our responsibility as policymakers in global affairs, for instance, to make sure that Canada has good relationships with both the UK and the European Union. But then, of course, we've also seen in the transatlantic context politicization of trade agreements, which is, I would say, more fundamental in that parts of the population have seen themselves as being losers of these trade agreements, that they only benefit economic elites and not the broader population. And that is a discontent about trade that is, I think, separate from this party politicization, and that is also more worrying. And here, I think it's very important for policymakers to take this seriously, to listen to trade-critical positions in negotiating trade agreements. But it's also important after an agreement has been negotiated to compensate losers of trade agreements through domestic policy. So often this is not about what is actually in the agreement, but what does a government do afterwards if a particular sector or group of population loses, but the government still thinks on balance the agreement is positive, then it will have to put in place domestic policies that compensate these losers.
So that ends our interview for today, and thank you again, Professor Hurrelmann, for joining us.